The Hector sails 10,000 miles to India. It is from the Deptford on the River Thames, a large vessel of its time, carrying 110 men and 24 guns, is dispatched by the East India Company in April 1607. An establishment by the Royal Charter of the Queen Elizabeth I provides the company the monopoly to undertake trading expeditions with India. £70,000 was raised for this voyage to the East, a time when Indian textiles and spices were high in demand in the world, and since Britain had nothing to sell to India that she needed, the imports from India were financed by silver and gold. Repeating for the first 150 years, traditionally, wealth has flown from west to east in the global economy. Indian textiles constituted the single largest item with which the British paid for African slaves. Not till the middle of 18th century, India's contact with Britain acquired colonial characteristics. With the invention of the flying shuttle, everything changed. Suddenly, Britain was able to manufacture cheap finished imitations of Indian cloth in lingerie mills, ironically created from Indian grown cotton. The forceful influx of cheap, machine made, mass produced textiles flooded India. British cotton cloth export to India now increased 51 times, while imports from India fell by a quarter. The thumbs of the skilled weaver were chopped off so they could never produce the fine cloth. Imposition of an exorbitant 85% tax for importing Indian hand-woven calico, whereas British textiles were imposed with only a 5% import tax in India. A bizarre form of international trade was thus imposed by Britain, and India was made to pay for her own exports. Sustaining deadly and merciless taxation, the massive deindustrialization of India paid for Britain's industrial revolution and violent global dominance. The peace trade had a lasting legacy in India. Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta from being company's initial factory locations to becoming the presidencies later. Due to the lack of the capital to trade profitably with China, the company was involved in what is called triangular trade, resulted in an exponential increase in the production of opium and forced labor in India. British ships would now come loaded with textiles for the Indian market, pick up opium as well as the payment for the exports, and then this opium would be smuggled into China. Opium would pay them in silver and use this to buy tea. To counter this dangerous exercise, the company botanist strategically smuggled more than 20,000 seedlings of tea from China. Tea estates were now established, destructing Indian forests. The discovery of indigenous Indian tea varieties, the finest in the world, with forced labor, was now a commodity for Britain's global trade. Along with commodities, 3.5 million Indians were also shipped as indentured labor to other British colonies around the world, a 5-year slavery pyramid system. With an increase in demand for Indian blue dye in Europe, the British saw indigo as a profitable crop. The skilled farmers of India knew the knowledge and complex process of obtaining natural blue dye from the plant. British indigo planters beat, tortured, murdered, extorted, and starved Indian farmers into turning over their food crop fields to the cultivation of the indigo plant. While export prices were low, high import taxes were imposed and the company made enormous profits. In 1895 alone, the total exports amounted to 9,366 tons, valued at over 3.5 million sterling. Only 2.5% of the market price was paid back to the farmers. Natural dye that was once a colonial capital. Not a chest of indigo reached England without being stained with human blood. Price fixing, buyer monopoly, brutal force, slave labor, violence, imprisonment, ruthless taxes, and strategic theft destroyed India's economy. During the era of British rule in India, 12 major famines occurred that killed more than 60 million Indians. When India was producing surplus exports, was there any reason for the famine to occur? Not if the British had not wanted it. Famines were engineered to strengthen the empire through ruthless looting. The grains from India were exported to keep up their colonial conquest. People resembled skeletons, covered by skin only, wandering around, hurling in corners, and dying by the millions. Imagine the valuation of flow of commodities, labor, and capital from India to Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by $45 trillion amount of wealth that was drained from India. 1.8 billion Indians died from deprivation. This figure is larger than the combined number of deaths from both world wars, including the Nazi Holocaust. India was governed for the benefit of Britain. The Englishman flourishes and acts like a sponge, drawing up riches from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down upon the banks of the Thames. For Britain, India was an extractive colony, founded it rich and left it poor. The hidden costs of the empire. The British Empire, where the sun never sets. What took for it to be this?